welcome to The Agenda, the first of a new series of Policy Exchange podcasts. Today we've got Ruth Kelly with us, who was a Cabinet Minister in the Blair and Brown years and is now joining Policy Exchange economics team to work on economic policy, particularly in the light of levelling up. Start with, you were elected in '97 for Bolton West, obviously a long time ago now. How do you think the challenges then and now differ on the economic front?
Yeah, 25 years ago, but funnily enough, some of the challenges are exactly the same. So I remember being a young parliamentary candidate, sort of knocking on doors in the streets of Bolton West, and people were complaining about public services being under stress, about water dripping through the roofs in schools, about long waiting lists in the NHS. And I was having a conversation with them about how we can properly fund public services. But yet, I was also deeply aware that we'd just seen the biggest tax rise in peacetime history. And I knew that the people of Bolton West didn't want to vote for higher taxes.
And you think the same thing's true today?
I do. I think the size of the state is a real issue. In fact, it's arguably much bigger than it was in 1997. So we now have a tax burden that's forecast to reach its highest level since the war. And we have ever more demands being placed on the government to try and, deal with what seems to be intractable problems in the public sector. So I'm actually really worried now about the size of the state. And the one thing I am sure of is that voters in Bolton West and those of my neighbours in the red wall seats in Bury North and Bury South, in Lee and around Bolton, wouldn't want to vote for a higher tax burden or a state that tried to take over functions that really are the functions of lower levels of society.
Yeah, when you set out what you're trying to achieve with the unit here, you said devolution is a sort of key driver, and devolution, if the sort of levelling up agenda is going to work, devolution is going to play a key part. Could you say something about that and why you think that's so important?
Absolutely key. So when I was Community Secretary, we looked at this and found that local authorities were spending 80% of their time looking upwards to government, trying to meet government-imposed targets, and only 20% of their time looking down to their local communities and trying to work out what was needed on the ground. And that is something we just have to turn around completely. Now, devolution deals have gone part way along the journey of devolving, but really it's more about decentralisation than it is about real devolution. It's still government setting the agenda and demanding, as it were, local areas to be accountable to government. What we need is local areas to be able to determine for themselves what's required and to be able to meet those challenges, those local challenges themselves.
So you think HS2 isn't the sort of model to follow for regional development?
I think it's virtually irrelevant to local economic development. I think we have to move away from these sort of vanity infrastructure projects. Now, I know that my government was the first to launch the project of HS2. It was after my time as Transport Secretary. I think what's much more relevant to local areas is investment in skills, investment in trying to create a really active local labour market, in removing the barriers to business and enabling businesses to thrive.
You say that when you were Education Secretary, one of the ideas was that the state should be the regulator and pay for education, but shouldn't necessarily provide it. You should boost the voluntary sector, private sector, and the public sector. We've only gone a very limited way down that road.
Yeah.
Do you think there's much more room to?
Much more. I mean, I saw the state really as a commissioner of services, not a provider of services. The local authority has a really important function in understanding the needs of local communities and ensuring that public services respond to the local requirements and needs and wishes of parents or of consumers in other areas. Now, how do we make that work in practice? In education, in some senses, it's more straightforward than in other areas because there's a real geographically defined area that you can look at different models of provision and work out, what might be required or desired in particular areas. But right across the public sector, I don't think the state, by necessity, should be the provider of the service. We have to think, for every pound that is being spent, how do we best provide value for money and have the local authority, as it were, overseeing that money rather than spending it.
There's a bit of a difference here in healthcare than in education, isn't there? Because in healthcare, while obviously there's this idea that any party which says healthcare, there should be charges on healthcare, will be destroyed. But there's also, there seems to be no public opposition to private purchase of healthcare. And it's gone to a great extent. I mean, no one objects to having their hip replacement in a private hospital paid for by the NHS. But there seems to be much more reticence to have private involvement in education. It seems to be much less taken off. I suppose it's partly because even in the private sector, most education providers are not-for-profit. But why do you think there is this resistance to private involvement in education?
I think it's to do with social mobility and the sort of charge that private schools are by their nature elitist. I don't agree with that, actually. Yeah. I think there can be really effective either for-profit or non-profit models of education that can do a decent job for children and, in fact, can rival any other provider in certain circumstances. We need to use what's most appropriate on the ground. So, actually, we need to move away from an artificial barrier between public and private and just look at what works.
The other sort of major thing you'd be looking at is productivity growth. And I see your concern, as Britain's been concerned for decades, of Britain's relatively low rate of productivity compared to France and Germany. What sort of policies do you think can...
Yes, I mean, I think if levelling up is to mean anything, it's got to be about unleashing productivity and prosperity across every local area and region in the country. Now, productivity growth has been on a historic trend of productivity rising at about 2% a year until we got to the financial crisis, at which point it's completely stagnated. So real wages and productivity have stagnated over the past 10 years or so, and we've got to really think now about how we can get the economy to be more productive in every area of the country. Now, that's a huge agenda. Partly it's about business investment, public and private investment, used correctly in the right ways. But also it's about innovation, encouraging economic clusters, thinking, at a local level about what makes places work, what particular unique factors they have, and how we can capitalise upon those.
Going back to the devolution point, so what powers would you want to see? How would you see that working? Who would powers be devolved to?
Well, at the moment, the rather complex sort of devolution deals at a sort of metro level. I'd like to see much simpler models of devolution, which looks outside the city region areas into different parts of the country. And I know that first steps have been taken towards those models, but we need to go much further and faster.
And you'd have an elected mayor or whatever you call them for a larger. You think you'd have a single person spearheading?
I think it really helps. I don't think it's essential, but I think it really helps if people feel more empowered if they are able to identify local initiatives with an individual that can be removed and very clearly removed at an election if they're not doing well. So you'll see in Greater Manchester, for example, that Andy Burnham's voice has been really heard, even at a national level, as representing the interests of Greater Manchester. And the support for him right across Greater Manchester at a mayoral level has been quite phenomenal, even those people who are traditionally voting a different way at general elections. So I think there is something about having visible leadership in places where people feel that leader is accountable to them. But the one thing I would say is that so far all talk of devolution really is about how you enable local leaders to spend government money.
Yeah.
Now that's not a great recipe for success, because you'll always get the local leaders blaming the government for not having enough money, and local people not knowing who they should hold to account.
You're saying you should have devolved tax raising powers?
I think there is a real role for local government to be at regional or at town level, or whatever level you decide, to have the ability to raise money locally.
Via?
Well, it might be through reform of business rates, for instance. But we need to think creatively about models whereby people can raise money locally as well as spend it locally. Yeah,
because that would be a big change for Britain, wouldn't it?
It would.
On taxation, you basically think that the taxation levels which we've reached now are about as high as they can sustainably go. I mean, you think that there'd be public opposition to...
I don't think it could go much higher, and the tax burden is the biggest since, just after the Second World War. And I think people understand why there's been particular pressure on the public finances recently through COVID, but at some point they will want to see that balance redressed. So now actually is the time when we need to think really seriously about structural changes that will enable that to fall in the future. But even more importantly, perhaps, is to have a growth agenda, because ultimately, you know, one of the easiest and best ways through these sorts of dilemmas is through GDP growth.
And when you look at the red wall seats, so you think the vote against Labour at the last election, did that have a lot to do with the fear that that government spending will go bonkers under Corbyn, or will it more just the personality?
I don't think Corbyn inspired trust.
Yeah.
I mean, definitely. There are all sorts of identity issues at play as well. But they do want to know that their money is being well spent. And I think the fact that real wages had stagnated for the previous 10 years was also a factor.
That harmed Labour. They still blame Corbyn for that.
Well, I think they will blame whoever's in government, actually, if that's not addressed.